In 2013, the Center for Sustainable Shale Development issued performance standards for gas extraction. A number of experts have reviewed these standards for the Delaware Riverkeeper Network and have issued a report saying the guidelines fail to protect the environment and human health. Retired Cornell University professor Anthony Ingraffea provides an overview of the problems with the standards.
The concept of safe, sustainable shale development goes against basic engineering and science knowledge and understanding. So CSSD performance standards are proposed to be safe and sustainable. So let's investigate those two words in order. Safe means nothing ever goes wrong. When you ask whether somebody or something is safe, if you say yes, then nothing ever happens that's bad. So it's impossible to develop any hydrocarbon resource, especially shale gas in the Marcellus, that is completely safe. That's an unattainable objective. Rather, one should see performance standards, in fact regulations, that acknowledge what all competent engineers know. And that is, whenever you're dealing with a process or a technology where there is risk, the best you can do is to mitigate, to control failure, not to avoid failure. So a major flaw in the whole concept of safe, sustainable shale gas development is that it can never be safe. The best one can do is to quantify the risk of the things that inevitably go wrong. There would not be an effort by CSSD to go beyond existing regulations. They didn't acknowledge that existing regulations do acknowledge that things go wrong. Writing more words doesn't make things safer. There is no such thing as safer. You're either safe or you're not. So the performance standard should acknowledge that there is always going to be risk, there will always be failure, and there should be a quantification of the probability of the failure, risk, and then a quantification of the cost to the public resulting from those failures. There's no such notion within the performance standards. They assume that things will either be not done or they'll be done safely. That, from an engineering perspective, is impossible. Let's look at the word sustainable. So from a climate change point of view, the last thing we want is a sustainable source of any fossil fuel. So in other words, in theory at least, one could have every operator drilling for shale gas in Pennsylvania performing exactly according to the performance standards. And one would conclude that everything's being done right, but it would still be wrong. So let's talk about the greenhouse gas aspects, or the mitigation of the release of greenhouse gas aspects that are in the proposed performance standards. As my colleague from Cornell, Professor Robert Howarth, has pointed out, what is proposed is vague and ambiguous. Again, there's no attempt to quantify what we know is currently happening. There are methane emissions. There are methane emissions during drilling. There are methane emissions during fracking. There are methane emissions due to operations on the well pads. And allegedly, these performance standards are supposed to decrease them. But there's nothing in the performance standards that acknowledges how much methane is being emitted, where it's being emitted from, so that we could hope to see a quantified reduction in that methane emission. Therefore, what is there is neither attainable nor unattainable, because anybody at this point can say we're doing better. If you don't know where you are, how are you going to know you're going to do better? That's what Professor Howarth is trying to point out in his criticism in the review. What Professor Howarth is pointing out, and I agree with him wholeheartedly since I'm a co-author with him, is that now, 3 years after our paper on methane emissions from shale gas development, every measurement, not estimate, not guess, but every actual measurement that's been done around the country on methane emissions from oil and gas operations has shown conclusively that the methane emissions are occurring at a much higher rate than anybody guessed. So the measurements are higher than the guesses. That's bad news. But the news gets doubly bad when we realize that over the last 3 years, Scientists have now determined that the impact of those methane emissions is even higher than we thought. So more emissions than we thought, larger impact than we thought. Multiply those together, and the climate problem, the climate change problem, is worse than we thought it was. So again, there is no quantitative assessment in the proposed standards that acknowledges that methane emissions are prevalent during shale gas development, nor is there a metric to shoot for. If the proposed standards are a higher bar, what's the lower bar? How do you know that you have a higher bar if you don't acknowledge what the lower bar is? So to date, only 4 of the over 60 operators seeking to develop shale gas in Pennsylvania have formally signed on to CSSD. What that tells me is that the vast majority of the operators have no interest in these performance standards and are going to stand pat on regulations that the existence of the performance standards implicitly says are insufficient. So there's a problem here. Either all the operators buy on to the idea that the present regulations are insufficient and they want to go beyond them, or the vast majority of the operators are laughing on the way to the bank saying that CSSD performance standards are something they don't want to go for because they're quite content with standards that are insufficient from an environmental point of view. They're cheaper to operate under, and therefore they're not going to buy into CSSD. It's one or the other. Each of the experts that wrote a section of the Delaware Riverkeeper's analysis of the CSSD performance standards is an expert in his or her own right. It would have been well advised for the CSSD to hire these people to assist them in writing performance standards. Had they done that, they would not be faced with acknowledging all the faults that these experts have found in analyzing these performance standards. I think the whole process was flawed from the beginning. It would have been a much better thing for the people involved in forming CSSD, rather than sitting in a room, which they said they did, for weeks and weeks, arguing with each other, operator against environmental group. How can we make things better? Bring in outside experts, disinterested, objective experts. That's when it should have been done. Open the whole process to the public. Bring in scientists from across the spectrum, climate scientists, hydrologists, human health scientists, well designers, fracking experts. Bring all those people into the room and let them argue out the situation. And you would have arrived then at a report like the Delaware Riverkeeper has put together, rather than the standards themselves, which are toothless.